Good evening, Booktopians, and welcome to another edition of Booktopia TV Live, where tonight we're talking with broadcaster, presenter, founding member of The Chaser, and author of the book Fight for Planet A, Craig Reucassel. Hey, Craig, welcome to Booktopia.
Mike, how are you? Seem to be having internet problems there.
Well,
I hope we can talk to each other.
Yeah, in this day and age, connection errors are par for the course. I'm sure everyone understands. I hope they do. So look,
I know exactly. I think we're all used to it.
Yeah. So you've had two TV shows this year with Fight for Planet A and Big Weather and How to Survive It. Plus, you've written the book, the Fight for Planet A book, that goes along with the series as well. A busy year for you by anyone's measure, and you've done it all through such an uncertain set of events that 2020 has thrown to us. When you look back on this year, what do you think you're going to be taking from it?
To never go through a pandemic again, I think. I mean, luckily, Fight for Planet A, the documentary, was filmed we finished that by the end of last year. Big Weather, actually, the last week of filming, we cut all the shoots we had because of COVID. And luckily, we'd shot enough of it that we kind of were able to get away with it. But yeah, it's been an interesting year. And I mean, part of me thinks I might not have finished writing the book had it not been for COVID, had it not been locked down. So, that's a positive or a negative. But, so yeah, it's been a kind of crazy year. It's interesting how COVID has kind of thrown so many curveballs that I feel like, a lot of people have lost jobs. But if you are working, it's kind of feels like you're kind of dog paddling and the whole time and getting nowhere a lot of the time. So yeah, it's been an interesting year. It's had some interesting things. I mean, the fact that we're doing this like this in a very natural way and normal way of talking to each other is a really interesting thing that's come out of COVID, and the way it's changed meetings and that. One of the strange things about the doco Fight for Planet A is that we did a lot of catch-ups with the families via Skype, but that was pre-COVID. So we thought that would look quite unique, and we did it to reduce our carbon footprint because we're like, we can't always fly to people to chat to them and catch up. That's ridiculous. But then when it came out, it was in the middle of COVID, so everyone just thought, oh, this is a normal COVID thing. It's quite strange.
At the beginning of the book, you draw comparisons between our approach to COVID and our approach to climate change. Can you expand a little bit on that for our viewers?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there have been some lessons from it. I mean, obviously, we had a period where our government was looking to the experts. We were following them. It was also a period where what the government did, what businesses did, and what we did mattered. It kind of all worked together. You kind of felt like, well, I have to do my little bit and stay at home, even though I might not be carrying COVID. And in a sense, climate change has a similar aspect, that it's best dealt with if we're dealing with it on all of those different aspects rather than going, it's your job, or your job, or your job. So that's similar. There are a lot of differences as well. I mean, I think COVID was so in our face and sudden, but even by the time months of it had happened, you saw that we lost our interest a bit. We're like, I'm not going to wear a mask anymore. And that's the whole fascinating thing about climate change. One of the things that makes it hard to deal with as a society is it's a very long-term thing, and humans are not good at dealing with long-term challenges. We're terrible at, thinking about our superannuation or something like that. So we deal with immediate threats, not long-term threats. So that's one of the real challenges of it. One of the things I think that's interesting, though, is that while I think we've learned a lot and it's dropped emissions in some areas, I think we have to not confuse it with, as in, we can't confuse the lockdown as being part of the solution to climate change. That's not how we're going to solve that problem. We can solve a lot of the threats of climate change with technology in a way that still allows us to be out and about and driving cars and doing things. It's not about being shut down in our house. That's not the solution at all. So yeah, I think there's some things we've learned there, but some things are going to go back to normal once we get rid of COVID.
Do you think that with late 2019 and the global marches for action on climate change, there was kind of a very strong public appetite for change, and then COVID came along in 2020 and kind of derailed that to a little bit for a little.
Yeah, I do think.
Yeah.
I do think it's happening.
Sorry.
Sorry, what was that?
What do you think we can do to get it back on the agenda?
Look, I mean, I think that part of the problem was really, people coming out of the fires are really motivated, I think, to look for change. I think the thing about COVID is not that people have changed their perception towards climate change, but I think that it just, when faced with a kind of trauma like COVID, it just takes away your energy to fight it in a way. I do think that as we get through this period, we'll get that energy coming back. Because I do think that one of the good things we're seeing is that there are a lot of solutions there, and there's a lot of momentum towards change. I think the American elections will also help the momentum, coming out of the Trump era as well. So I think that that's going to happen. I think in Australia, we're a long way behind a lot of other countries in terms of that tipping point, but I do feel like we're getting towards that. So yeah, it's been delayed. It's been pushed back a little bit. But as I said, it's also been interesting it's changed our behavior in some ways that will actually be positive for, climate change reasons. So, the fact that Sydney to Melbourne was the second most traversed route in the world, it was second nature for people to get up and go, I'll go to Melbourne and back today and do that kind of thing. I think that's going to be challenged. I mean, a lot of businesses will go, hang on a second, we're going to fly Dave down that one meeting. It'll change some of those things there. But look, in most cases, it's still going to be, we're going to go back to flying. We're going to go back to all those other things.
And I just wanted, before we move on to the next question, just to let our audience know, if you guys have questions for Craig that you would like to ask, please drop them into the comments and we'll do our best to address them towards the end of our chat. So you begin the book by saying that you almost want to skip talking about the actual problems that are at the heart of causing climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about why you kind of were reluctant to engage in that?
Well, I guess the thing is that yeah, the second chapter, I'm like, well, look, I think you could probably, we already know this, the kind of effects of climate change. We could probably skip it and you could listen to a scientist. But look, it is interesting how one of the things I found making the documentary is often we presume everyone has the same amount of knowledge as all of us. And I'm not saying I'm extremely knowledgeable. I've learned a lot through making the documentary, obviously. So I think if you can sometimes skip the first few steps, people go, oh, you're further down the path. I don't get what you're talking about. So going back to the basics and just looking at, okay, what are the effects going to be? What are the impacts going to be in Australia, for instance? It actually probably was worthwhile doing in the end, even though I joked that we could probably just skip this because we've been talking about climate change for 40 years. But, there you go. Look, it is good to look back and look at those impacts because, and again, it comes back to that problem of like that some of the impacts, like rising sea levels, are really, they're not, I'm not telling anyone to be scared about tomorrow, really. There are a few areas we've seen some areas around Australia that have had tidal swells and houses have been knocked down and that, but it's a very small proportion. But there are threats in terms of, heat waves, in terms of fire seasons, all that kind of stuff that are really absolutely on our doorstep. And we've been predicted 10, 15, 20 years ago, and now we're going, oh, yeah, you're right. Hey, probably should have listened to you back then, hey, scientists. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that you do bring it down to a very elegant summation after appearing reluctant to talk about it. That really does make it very clear, like what the causes are and what is at stake. And part of that is kind of butting up against the debate around climate change. Why does this debate exist?
Yeah, well, look, this is the thing: is it's not really scientists' fault. Like they've been telling us for years, and most of them have been telling us this. It's a political issue, really, and it's been increased by parties such as Exxon and other oil companies, and that paying for spin to be created. I mean, the amazing thing about it, and I always think this is interesting, is that you can kind of understand the people that have been paid to do it right. But there's an enormous amount of people out there. There'll be people today on Facebook who are kind of typing away these little things about, oh, you're lying to me about this kind of thing, having no idea that has been created by a PR company, probably in America somewhere. They've been paid by people who benefit from slowing down our response to climate change. And you think you've come up with this brilliant argument. It's been tested. I actually look at one of the interesting guys, one of the guys that actually did a lot of the kind of testing of what works in a climate denial sense. He's since become totally transitioned and he totally believes it, understands it's happening. And that's because his house was nearly burnt down. It's like, what have we got to do? We've got to bring a bushfire to the door of every climate change denialist to get it to change. But, like, unfortunately, political reasons and kind of money put into spin and denial are the reasons we've been so slow about it. But that's also quite unique to Australia as well. Australia, America, a few countries around the world are really, it's seen as a political issue, a left-right issue. In so much the same way, you look at America right now, and whether or not you wear masks is seen as a left-right issue. In Australia, it's not. It's just seen as well, that's how you deal with coronavirus issue. That's how the rest of the world looks at Australia when we think about climate change as being a left-right issue. They're like, what? You go overseas and conservative governments are totally and utterly leading the charge to change climate change, because it's just like, well, we're just dealing with the science. Australia, unfortunately, has been caught in this strange, political battle, which is rubbish.
Is there a way out of it, do you think?
I think we're slowly getting out of it. Like, we're seeing some great leadership actually from conservative governments at the state level, and who are talking about it, as a conservative issue, because it's not a left-right political issue, really. I mean, I often get introduced as an environmentalist, and I don't think I really am, to be honest. I mean, I care about the environment, but I don't consider myself to be at the forefront of environmental movement. Climate change is well and truly beyond just an environmental movement. You can hate koalas and trees and shit like that and then still really care about climate change, because fundamentally it's going to threaten the way we live as humans. So it's kind of it's a much broader issue than that. So yeah, I think we are starting to see change happen. Interestingly, it's interesting over the last year that you don't see any, apart from Matt Canavan, you don't really see any conservative politicians talking about coal as much now. And that's because it's just kind of, the numbers have been going against that in terms of it's too expensive. No one's going to build a coal-fired power station. I think I use the analogy in the book of it's like if you've got two Airbnbs next to each other. One's been given to the family by their kind of parents and it's totally paid off and you're renting it out. The other's just been built and you've got a mortgage on it, right? That's the difference between when people say coal is cheap. It's only cheap if you built the power station 40 years ago and you've paid it off. It's the only time it's cheap. If you're building right now, no one's going to build a coal-fired power station. It's an absolute rip-off compared to renewable energy. It's ridiculous. So, look, I think the economics are moving in our favour, and also things like the student strikes for climate are also been great. I mean, there's a lot of momentum, whilst there's also important bits of pushback as well.
Yeah. So there's a lot of talk around the difference between government responses and individual responses, and where the balance should be met. How did you approach this kind of split when you were working on this series?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk to people about what they can do. But I'm aware that makes people very angry as well. Certain people go, nothing to do with us, it's government that can do it all. That's true to a point. Government has a lot more power to change it, but it's not a simple thing. Like post doing War and Waste, I was really interested in seeing the way that it worked. Post War and Waste, I came into it kind of expecting you tell the government this is where we need to change, and they'd respond. And it didn't happen that way. What you'd actually see is that people in the public would start engaging with the issue more. That led to businesses changing first because they were kind of closer to their consumers, And then government would slowly come around and councils would come around probably quicker, and then government would slowly come around. And I had politicians say to me, look, we don't actually lead, we follow. So politicians are very astute. They know what's going on in the community. If they start to see a lot more activity from people in terms of actually pushing for change and going, hang on a second, how come I want to get an electric car but there's no chargers around? How come I want to make these changes, but there's no infrastructure for it? They'll start to push back against politicians. So it's not saying that you can solve it yourself personally. It's saying that that's part of the process of getting change to happen. And a lot has to happen from a government level. I've tried to do change in my own life, and you hit a barrier and you go, okay, this is where government needs to come in there. But it's a two-way thing. It's a kind of feedback loop that actually happens. And the sad thing is in Australia, I actually did the numbers that I was going, we've got 10 million households in Australia. I'm not even talking people, just households. If each one of them dropped half a ton of emissions, that's actually the same amount we dropped in the last year where our emissions actually went down in Australia. And you go, oh, shit. It's so sad that the bar is so low that we can actually achieve it through just households making simple changes. Like half a ton is nothing changing.
So kind of further on that point, I think, looking at it from an economic perspective, You talk a lot about the economics of global warming and action from government and from an individual perspective. And a point that really stood out to me is that we're currently paying for global warming twice via the subsidies that we give through our taxes to big polluters, and then through the cost of catastrophic climate change. The example that you point to a couple of times is 60,000 jobs that are at stake on the Great Barrier Reef. What's the future of the economic conversation, do you think?
Yeah, look, it's fascinating, actually. I think one of the, because, I look at individual things, but I look a lot at government as well. One of the things that I think outrages me the most looking at it was where I just went back over the history of how much money we've given through tax to carbon capture and storage in Australia. It's billions of dollars, right? And basically, it's like the coal and gas industries know they're dying off, but they just want to get as much money, before it happens, and they keep getting it. So even under Kevin Rudd, who's like, climate change is the biggest challenge, half of his clean energy fund, more than half, went to kind of clean coal. And we've actually had no clean coal come out of it. I think the funniest example I found was this one particular group who had like $32 million given to them. They didn't achieve any carbon capture and storage, but what they did achieve was a very successful stall at the Harvey Agricultural Show where they showed kids carbon dioxide using fizzy drinks. I'm like, well, that was worth $32 million well spent, wasn't it? But not only that, I mean, the example we gave in the show of like, it's just ridiculous. Like, I know we're not going to close down coal straight away in Australia. Understand that, and there's people's jobs that are protected there. But we are giving massive coal companies, like we gave Glencore a couple of years ago $163 million. We gave Yancoal from China $102 million to subsidize their diesel on their site. So we're kind of subsidizing their fossil fuels while they dig fossil fuels. And then we're going, oh, no, we take climate change really seriously. It's just ridiculous. Like massive amounts of money are being spent on protecting the old industries. And it's just, it's so frustrating, so frustrating.
I'd like to talk about a couple of specific chapters from the book before we move on to any audience questions. What is important when it comes to home energy use, and how big of a difference can we make at home through electricity?
Yeah, we can make a big difference. It's interesting. One of the things I found really interesting in doing the documentary, because the documentary was an actual experiment. We didn't know the results. What I was really pleased with and really surprised me were that there were, the school that we went to, for instance, and also some of the households that couldn't get solar power, they were just able to make small changes that made a big difference. Like we'd cut their energy bill by a third or even more in some cases, actually. And you just went, oh, wow. It's really interesting that they just not by spending anything, but by just those kind of changes in habits, you're able to make a big change like that. But the other thing is that you can, if you put solar on, it's an absolute no-brainer in Australia nowadays. Like most people who put solar on have not. I looked at studies. They haven't done it for environmental reasons. They've done it to cut their energy bills. But it's had a massive impact in Australia. So we now have just the kind of solar power coming off rooftops and small businesses is more energy than all of the coal-fired power stations in New South Wales. It's had a massive impact. And it's a great example of where lots of small things that may not seem impactful add up to being really impactful. And that's, I guess, the kind of thing I'm trying to teach people is that I know it seems ridiculous, I can't do anything on my own, but don't think of it as being on your own. Think of it as 1 million people, 2 million people doing the same thing. And even if you can't put solar panel on, you can pay a tiny bit extra, and it's becoming cheaper and cheaper for green energy, which basically makes your energy provider have to go out and invest in more green energy. And they can't just say, oh, I've already got some spare solar power sitting here. They've got to go and invest in more. So it's, there are lots of things you can do, and it has a big impact.
Yeah, and I think something that stands out in that part of the book as well is just the areas in your home where you might not think a lot of energy is being expended, and it is, and the areas where the inverse is true.
Yeah, like we always think, oh, that's a big TV, that's going to be so much energy. It's generally not going to be much energy. It's like things like having your showers in your baths. Hot water is a massive part. The Australian government, I think, at one point said it was up to like 25% of your energy use can be coming from your hot water. So, if you use cold water in your washing machine, and if you just have a shorter shower, those things can have big impacts and cut your bills. And again, that's not going to overall solve the whole problem, but that really can add up quite substantially as well.
Yeah, I like the one-song shower instead of a three-song shower.
Yeah, I love the guys from Wollongong were wonderful. They were very Yeah, they were very funny. It's just like going, we're trying to do it with one song. We're trying to do, can we find the right song?
An epic Iron Maiden one that goes for 10 minutes.
That's right. They're cheating.
Yeah. You talk about ways to reduce your carbon footprint. What is the main impact of food on global warming?
Yeah, like food is a big one. Agriculture is a large part of our footprint. And it's interesting because when we looked at doing food for the show, a lot of people kind of warned us off. They were like, don't do food. People hate it when you tell them to change your diet. And I'm not a vegetarian. I am trying to reduce my meat as much as I can, but I'm not a vegetarian. So I understand that. I understand that kind of people not wanting to be told how to change their food. But we looked at it, and we looked at some of the households, and a big part of their footprint was their food. So we went, look, let's not say everyone has to be vegan, which is the traditional view. Let's actually also look at different meats and compare them, and different fish, or all those kind of things. And it was fascinating to look at that and just see, the fact that kangaroo and chicken, for instance, massively reduced footprint compared to cows and sheep. And again, with cows and sheep, there's some really interesting technological changes on the horizon that might mean we can get really reduce their footprint as well. So I'm not coming to this, this book's a bit of a choose your own adventure in a sense that you can kind of go through it and go, look, that, not going to do that. This one I can do, this one I won't do. That's how it's going to work. Not everyone is going to do every step of it. And I don't expect that. I think that there can be a tendency to push for this kind of mad perfection on this stuff. That's not going to happen. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's kind of a long process. You'll go, I can't afford that now, but maybe in a few years, that's the thing I can do that'll make a big difference.
Yeah, perfect is the enemy of good, right?
Yeah, exactly. Perfect is the enemy of good. I've definitely never got to perfect. Well off it.
So what, with meats like beef, what drives the really big carbon footprint that it has?
Yeah, I mean, it's the methane. It's burping, basically. It's the way their stomachs work, the ruminants. And that's why I was really fascinated, actually, by kangaroos, because kangaroos are red meat, but they've got a different stomach system, so they don't do as much burping, and they don't create the methane when they're actually chewing their food. So that's why they're so much better than cows and sheep. Cows and sheep are a fairly similar level. Cattle are a little bit ahead because they tend to live longer. So, yeah, that's the main problem, is that methane that's created by the gut and is burped out is unfortunately a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's kind of 80 times more powerful than CO2, although it lasts for a lesser period. So that's why if you can get rid of that, one of the great things about the kind of solution, the seaweed solution that's been looked at by the CSIRO, one of the great things about that is that if the cows eat that seaweed just once a day, it pretty much removes almost all of the methane. And it's really good for the cow as well. It actually kind of, they grow quicker. It's better for the farmer as well. So it's like a win-win on every level. The problem with it is you go, how do you get your cow to eat seaweed every day? If they're dairy cows, they come in each day, so you can easily do it. If they're at if they're at a feedlot, you can do it. But most cows in Australia aren't at feedlots. They're out in the farm. What do you do? The farmer gets up every morning. Right, 100 acres. Let's go out and find where's Daisy gone? Feed her with seaweed. So unfortunately, that part of the solution isn't quite there yet, but we're getting there on some fronts.
You can lead a cow to seaweed, but you can't.
Exactly.
Moving over to the government side of things, specifically transport, which is a huge contributor to emissions. We have low petrol standards, poor public transport, and kind of a cultural love of bigger cars. What can the government do to address these things?
Yeah, look, one of the bits that shocked me the most, or I found most amusing in doing this book, was I went back over, compared European policy to Australian policy, which sounds very boring, but it becomes amusing because what you realise is that, Europe's made all these changes and just brought in these changes and massively brought down their emissions. They still drive cars. They're still getting around. They've still got fast cars and four drives and that. But in Australia, just every few years, we bring out a new discussion paper. We basically bring out the same discussion paper every few years and never do any of it. And you know what's happened? Bugger all has happened. That's how it's been approached. So the funny thing is that was it not for COVID, we would have had another discussion paper as well. I was really disappointed we didn't get that seventh one that doesn't achieve any change. But we've just got to actually bite the bullet. And the thing about that, again, is that it's presented as if it's to our disadvantage. It's not to our disadvantage. If you have better fuel standards and more efficient, you spend less on fuel. The people that are benefiting from this are fuel companies, not us. We pay hundreds of dollars more because of our low fuel standards in Australia. And also, the countries that have actually encouraged electric vehicle use, in those countries, there are like waiting lists a year long because people are like, well, this is a cheaper and better way of traveling. And again, we're not saying that it'll work for everyone. I'm not saying there will still be Land Cruisers on the roads. There'll still be people for whom the Troopy is still the best form of transport. But for a lot of people, it will be a much cheaper and easier way to travel. And, why wouldn't you be doing it?
And while we're on that topic, electric car versus muscle car.
Yeah, well, that was the best part. Well, it was an interesting part of the documentary, racing a Tesla versus the V8 Australian car. It was very frightening, I'll just say that. Like, I'm not somebody who's drag races generally. And the speed in those kind of cars, because electric cars, every bit of power goes immediately to the wheels, which doesn't happen with a petrol or diesel car. So you get this punch off the line that just throws you backwards, and your entire, like, my guts were in the boot. But it's, the suggestion that Australians like a bit of grunt and therefore they won't like electric cars is very misleading, despite being a key election plank last year. The thing I loved actually about doing that was it was the guy David Sultana, who was like, the muscle car guy. He was so thrilled by it. He was like, oh, we're going to have so much fun with this. Because, he's more likely to get a Tesla than I am. Bloody hell, I can't afford a Tesla. So, yeah, interesting. But the problem is that in Australia, again, we don't have the policies to develop this, It's, unfortunately, it's, why would you send electric cars generally to Australia? We have nothing dragging them here at the moment. So we'll get there eventually, hopefully.
And so what do you hope that readers take from not only the series...
I've lost you there.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Oh, internet problems.
Internet problems.
Go again.
Here we go. Can you hear me now, Craig?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, cool. What do you hope readers of the book and viewers of the show are going to take away from your work?
I lost that whole question.
I'll try again. Can you hear me?
We need to get Booktopia some better internet. Maybe
I should write it down and hold it up.
Booktopia is an online bookstore. It should have the best internet of all.
But we're
too many people are ordering books.
Yeah, that's right.
You're bringing the Wi-Fi down.
Yeah, no, it's my house's terrible Wi-Fi. Unfortunately, I'm working from home. Yeah. So what do you hope readers take from the book and from the series?
Look, I hope there's a real mix in the book. Like, I hope they take some hope, because I think there are a lot of great things that are happening, and there's a lot of things there that mean that we can solve this problem. So hope is something I hope you take. But I also think I hope they take a little bit of outrage from it, because there are definitely parts of the book that outraged me when I was writing them. And I think that you need that little bit of that outrage to realize that it's not just up to us. We need to kind of be asking for more from our leaders. We're definitely not getting enough. We're not getting leadership on this particular issue. So, yeah, I think you should take away that there are things you can do, but that's not just up to you. And that we need to really put more pressure on our politicians. And that's not a political issue. That's not a left-right issue. It's this is a massive problem we need to deal with. In much the same way that we kind of, in Australia, and we're really proud of this, we responded really well to coronavirus. We need to do a similar kind of approach on climate change.
And
particularly because we're going to be hammered.
Yeah.
Yeah. Australia is really affected by climate change, unfortunately.
You've probably emerged as one of the more prominent voices on the climate change issue over the past couple of years in Australia. And you mentioned in the book that you get asked this question a lot, but I'm going to ask it to you again, which is, are you ultimately optimistic about the future on Planet A?
Yeah. And yeah, look, I oscillate. There are times that I find it really frustrating and depressing. But overall, I would say I really do see a positive way forward. And I do see momentum is picking up. Australia's behind in some ways, but momentum overall I feel like is picking up, and that makes me think that overall I'm quite hopeful. And the example I give in the book, and the thing that really made me hopeful when we were filming the documentary, was visiting Cape Grim, and it was the biggest surprise I got in filming it, because at Cape Grim we've measured the kind of CO2 in the atmosphere since the 1976, I think it was started, and it comes across the Indian Ocean there. And that's why we measure it there, because it's kind of the cleanest air. And I thought, okay, that's the cleanest air. But they showed me the air that came across Melbourne, and that was, the CO2 was higher. You could see it directly that if it came across from the mainland, it was higher because it's come across pollution, essentially. But what was fascinating is when it came across Tasmania, I thought it might be better than Melbourne, but not better than coming across the Indian Ocean. But it was actually better than coming across the Indian Ocean, and that was because Tasmania, as an island, has an enormous amount of trees that suck in the carbon dioxide. It has hydropower, so there's no coal-fired power stations there, small amount of cars. And you just went, okay. It's a little microcosm that shows you that you can, if we do all these positive things, it has an immediate effect. If we have more trees, if we have renewable energy, if we start driving cars that have, are charged by renewable energy rather than by petrol and diesel, that'll have an immediate effect. So we actually have those solutions there. So, I did feel more hopeful after that day. Although, as I said, look, you can't be part of the climate journey without having those days of, you gotta be joking.
All right, well, over to some audience questions now. We've had a few through in the feed. So one question, hey Craig, loving the chat, and I'm a massive Chaser fan. This is from Nick. In line with what has happened in 2020 around the issues we face around misinformation, from your perspective, do you think the challenge of combating the fractured narrative around choosing what to believe and what not to believe is now as big a problem as the physical act of combating climate change?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because in many ways, climate change was well ahead of this. Like, I feel like what's happened now is that we have this contestability about issues, and we have different realities happening about a lot of issues. We've had that for many years on climate change, and we had it pre-social media, which of course has kind of increased that particular tendency. So yeah, it's interesting. It does make it harder. It does make it makes it, and this is what's interesting actually, given what Nick has said there, given that kind of different narrative thing, what's surprising, if you actually look at it, like over 80% of Australians think climate change is a problem and that we need to do something about it. Australia has quite a high rate of climate deniers, but it's still only about 7 or 8% of people who are actually climate deniers. So we tend to think, because of the media, that there's a kind of 50-50 in terms of when it comes to climate change and climate denial. Climate denial is a dying breed, and it has really been quashed by proper information over many years. Sorry, it seems like military helicopters coming to get me. Must have said something wrong. But yeah, so it's good that we've got ahead of that this real division that's coming through some of our social media, and I guess the differentiation of our media. But one of the reasons we are behind in Australia is because that media polarisation has happened in a way that's made things like one of our most powerful media organisations, News Limited, has, I think, been a bit more on the climate denial front. Not that it's all that, but it has been more on that front, and that has slowed down change in Australia as well. So, yeah, we've been disadvantaged by it, even though that preceded the kind of polarisation that we're talking about there.
Another question, are there any companies out there that are changing their tune and starting to focus on green energy more?
Oh yeah, there's heaps. There's lots of Australian companies. Woolworths just this week has said they're going to be 100% renewable energy by, I think it was 2025, not 2030. There's kind of a mix of them. There's a lot that are saying 2025, a lot that's saying 2030, and that's a really important thing, because when a company says we're going to be fully renewable energy, it's not just about putting solar panels on their roofs. It's generally about saying we're going to buy this much extra solar or renewable energy from the grid. And what that does is it allows somebody to kind of build a power station that is a renewable energy power station that's solar or wind or whatever, and it encourages that. And that slowly is going to push the coal-fired power, which is creating damage, out of the system. So it's a really positive step. And we can do that ourselves, by the way. If you buy green energy, it's the same thing. So we're the same as Canberra saying 100% renewable, or Woolworths saying they're 100% renewable. If you buy green energy, you're doing exactly the same thing. You're just saying all of my energy has to come from a new renewable source. So, and that's that's making a big change. So there's lots of companies that are doing that. You can see Re100 has a list of the companies that are already doing it. I think Bank Australia is already at 100%. A lot of the banks are going to be 2025 or 2030. A lot of companies are starting to do it. So, yeah.
Another question from the audience. If we all go to rooftop solar, how do we change the transition network so it works out both ways, i.e. power in and power out?
Yeah, we've got to definitely do that. And it's interesting, there's experiments happening on this. This is one of the examples I put in the book. A fascinating example where in South Australia, they put batteries on the side of houses. This is kind of network of houses. I can't remember. It's like 1,000 houses. You can correct me when you get the book. And what happened was, because batteries are really quick, so they make it so that not only can they save power, but they can put power back into the grid. And there was an amazing instance where a coal-fired power station in Queensland basically had a bit of a dip in power. It had a problem, dipped, so the grid lost a lot of energy. And these 1,000 houses just in South Australia, they are the ones that fed most of the energy back into the grid. And you just go, there's that fascinating. That's what we're going to have. We're going to have that capacity to kind of, and already, if you've got solar power ready, when you don't use it, generally speaking, unless you're off grid, it will feed back into the grid. So that's already happening. And this is what we need. At the moment, we don't really need, our government's role is not necessarily to encourage renewable energy as much, because that's happening and it's much cheaper anyway. It's to fix those problems in the grid. It's to be saying, we need to build some pumped hydro so that we can store power during the day when we have lots of solar energy, and that can then be used at night time when we're not getting as much sun. So that's what we need from our government. At the moment, we have a government that's trying to push another alternative, which is the gas fire, despite the fact that our gas usage is going down every year. It's a bizarre suggestion.
So I know that you've come off the back of a very busy 2020, and I hate to ask this question, but what have you got in the pipeline lined up next?
So next year, working on a couple of shows for the ABC, and I'm directing a kind of a feature documentary with Christian Van Vuren in it from the Bondi Hipsters, which looks at kind of, I guess, influence in politics and that kind of stuff. So that's keeping me busy at the moment. Hopefully that'll be in your cinemas if they exist early next year, or in the ABC in the second half of the year. So keep an eye for those. But working on a few different things. I'm doing a play the second half of next year as well, bizarrely enough. So, the ensemble. So a few different things. But, the process of writing a book is intrigued me. I've got a few ideas kicking around now, going, maybe I could do that again. Not that I said that when I was writing the book. When I was writing the book, I was like, why would anybody write a book?
Well, you've said it publicly now in front of your fans, and I'm sure your publisher's watching as well. So that's a binding verbal contract to deliver another book.
Really? Oh, no.
All right, Craig. Well, we don't want to take up too much more of your time. So thank you so much for your time this evening. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. And you can purchase Fight for Planet A right now at booktopia.com.au.
Indeed. Yes. Thanks so much, Mark. Cheers. Thanks for the chat. Cheers.
Thanks.